What has your experience been with sex ed?
My experience with sex ed is not quite that helpful to me.
My experience in sex ed, I feel like it was very bare minimum.
So I haven't really had that much experience in sex ed. In middle school, we briefly touched on the reproductive system.
I had a teacher freshman year who his entire class for health was sex ed. There was no anything else. And then junior year, when I had another teacher, his curriculum was entirely different. Didn't even touch on the subject at all. So freshman year was the last time we had a sex ed class.
In the Philadelphia School District, sexual education is an afterthought. Some teachers choose to teach it, some don't.
Another teacher might be more into first aid. Another teacher might be into more the mental health. I kind of like to deal with the sex part, so the sex ed part where the kids have some kind of experience.
So they don't say anything to you, like you have to teach any kind of sex ed?
No, they do not, no. It's recommended by the health department, the health ed department of the school district.
The state of Pennsylvania does not require anyone to teach sex ed. Every state decides for themselves whether to teach sex ed or not.
The beauty and the complexity of American federalism is we have 50 states, and that means we have 50 laws. And so they all differ. And within those states, school districts differ. So it's extraordinarily difficult to generalize about sex ed in this country. This is an irreducibly diverse country, and so sex ed is itself diverse.
Sex ed is relatively new to public school curricula in the United States. We talked to Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, for insight into the origins of sex ed.
Sex education in the United States began with venereal disease outbreaks in big cities like Chicago and New York in the early 20th century. There was a huge amount of anxiety about this because middle-class men were patronizing prostitutes, which has always been a conduit for STDs, and then going home and infecting their wives. There was a very ugly racial and, to our sensibilities, racist dimension to this, because one of the concerns is that white people were doing this and therefore promoting infertility among whites, because of course STDs are associated with infertility. In the early 20th century, the Army did a lot of both research and propaganda surrounding the dangers of VD, especially during the First World War. If you look at a figure like C. Everett Koop, who was a Surgeon General at the beginning of the HIV outbreak, the epidemic, he was quite forward in urging school districts to address HIV.
Because of this, many teachers focus solely on AIDS and HIV education as their sex ed curriculum.
So I cover the very early basics of HIV and AIDS.
This is one example of a more risk-reducing approach to sex ed.
In the United States, I would argue it hasn't changed a great deal. The constant thread is the negative dimension to sex ed. And when I say negative, sex ed in this country has always been oriented towards preventing certain negative outcomes, either STDs or unwanted pregnancies.
They teach you basically that abstinence is essentially what you should be doing instead of taking the risk of contracting some certain conditions or diseases, when in reality that's not realistic advice.
Regarding abstinence and the like, we believe the kids have a choice with that, and I think, personally, in my opinion, a lot of it should come from the home.
The teacher's content is variable, so every student has a different knowledge base with varying degrees of accuracy and detail. To provide unity in students' understandings of sexual health, Gilberto Lopez and his team at the Philadelphia Department of Public Health have worked extensively to create a citywide program aimed at reducing the rates of STDs among the adolescent population.
I have a team of 2 or 4 people that go to the schools, plus interns if possible. And they present video as well as an oral presentation afterwards, following up on the video and kind of doing like some Q&A with the students and just kind of engaging them before offering them the testing part, which is the screening. So the video, the oral presenter, and then the screening, where each student gets little brown bags where they can choose to test or not for gonorrhea and chlamydia. So the STD control program gets funding, grant funding from the federal government, CDC.
Even though the STD control program is a government initiative, they can't single-handedly provide sexual education for all Philadelphia students. Private organizations try to help provide a more complete picture. Planned Parenthood is by far the most well-known private provider. We went to one of their branches to see how they get involved in sex education.
My name is Zakira, and my position is a sexual health educator. My primary role is to do community education in our schools and around our community.
We also went to the Health Resource Center at Central High School to talk to Mimi Yedinak, who works for the Family Practice and Counseling Network, a program that also receives government funding to provide sex ed to public schools.
I run the Health Resource Center, and that's a place in the school where students can come and get condoms, menstrual supplies, information about birth control, referrals for appointments, pregnancy testing, and people can come in if they are experiencing symptoms of possible STIs, and we can talk about it, and I can help them figure out where to go to get tested. The other thing I do is healthy relationships counseling. So I kind of use like a loosely based cognitive behavioral therapy model to talk to students when they're, having issues with their partner or want to have better communication, things like that.
Both Planned Parenthood and the Family Practice and Counseling Network receive government funding for some of their services.
Our government funds only covers typically services rendered in our health centers. Our education program is supported by private grants and donations.
This program is a Title X funded situation. So basically it's a type of government funding that's used specifically for reproductive and family planning services.
Both organizations actively work to offer students informative lessons on teen pregnancy and consent at a much deeper level than what is taught in their health classes. Planned Parenthood is also a major lobbying group which pushes lawmakers to consider changing sex ed policy.
Our education department works directly with school administration and officials to advocate that sex education is a priority in our school's curriculum. And our external affairs department works to educate our elected officials on the services we provide to reduce misinformation or stigma about those services. And in turn, the elected officials can become advocates for the issues that affect us, the services we provide, and reproductive health care in general. We provide a variety of programming as far as education goes. I can say one of the favorites is our Safer Sex lesson, which talks about pregnancy prevention and STI prevention. We do a show and tell of contraceptions, and we talk about how young people can access services either for free or reduced cost throughout the city.
I would say overall kids are much more educated in this area for sure. They have more of an understanding of these issues and just better understanding of anatomy and birth control and stuff like that. But not always. I still get plenty of kids who come in and they're like, I don't even understand where to put a tampon. Can you help me? Like that sort of thing.
We asked our classmates about their experience with sex ed and what they felt like they have and have not learned.
I feel like I have learned the most about STDs and STIs and the least about consent.
My teacher just passing out paper and put up a video and just have us fill out those papers by watching it. And I don't feel like it's as engaging or informative for a student to grab something that is very sensitive.
I feel like I have the most knowledge about STDs. That was something that was covered pretty in-depth, I'd say. Teen pregnancy, that's something that was covered, but I'd say I know the least about, because although that's something that they covered, it's like something that they brushed over very slightly.
I think I have the most knowledge on STDs and STIs. I think I have the least knowledge on teen pregnancy.
Here, we're only talking to public school students. In private districts, the sexual education curricula look very different.
And I should emphasize that some of our private schools take a very different approach to sex ed, and I would argue a much more explicit and, in my own view, healthy one. So if you look at the Quaker schools in this city, you find that some of them have a very different set of goals for sex ed, which is closer to the goals that you see in Northern Europe. Not to warn people and to scare them, but to try to help each person develop a healthy sexual life. I don't think you can do that in most American public schools, but you can do it in some private ones. A lot of people on the left want to be both multiculturalists and advocates of this thing called comprehensive sex ed. So they want to be multicultural in the sense they want to celebrate diversity, right? Just think of the rainbow on people's cars. But they also want this comprehensive sex ed that addresses, abortion, masturbation, all these, detailed and intimate subjects. And I don't think you can have it both ways, because a lot of people in that rainbow come from cultures and faith traditions for which this kind of comprehensive approach is anathema. I'm not saying we should necessarily defer to them, but I am saying we should be honest enough to acknowledge this tension.
So how can we improve sex ed?
Some topics that I feel like are very important are like the mental aspects and like the interpersonal aspects of sexual relationships, as well as like, I feel like they should cover like sexual relationships between people who who don't identify as straight, so like the LGBT community.
I definitely like to see sex ed being taken more seriously in school, starting like freshman year all the way to senior year. You don't need to have it 1 year to you can't learn everything about it in like half a year in one class.
Consent is so important, and I feel like a lot of people don't really have the best idea of what constitutes consent at all.
A way that we can improve that is, one, making sure that students have access to reproductive education or sex education in general, and allowing organizations such as Planned Parenthood to come into the schools and be able to teach programs, in a non-judgmental, accurate information, and also open,
What I think should happen is much more dialogue and discussion about sex ed, especially among our young people, to figure out what it is they want and they need. I think adults have been too loud on this subject, and our students have been too quiet.